Hello and welcome to this third session on the module The Reflective Practitioner. Today we'll be looking at the concept of change. Traditionally we tend to think of change as a single event, single things that happen to us and stick out clearly in our mind, but it's perhaps more useful to develop an understanding of change as a process rather than a single event. In other words, to use a metaphor, which we'll also be looking at the idea of metaphor and that explanatory power of metaphor, change is a journey rather than a destination. One of the features of change is that it's a transformative process. That means that we begin in one state, and this metaphor that I'm using at the moment is a caterpillar, popular book that you might know, involving this state, or one state behind, one state of being, and moving into another state. Quite a simple example to illustrate the point. Many writers on reflection and transformative learning also propose that when we experience a change, we are somehow transformed. Change just does not come and go and leave us unaffected. Once we experience change, we cannot go back to a previous state. So just like the caterpillar in our example, once turned into a butterfly, cannot return to the state of being a caterpillar if they didn't like it as a butterfly. The change and transformation is permanent, and that's true of when we experience change. Generally, in the literature, and this might ring true with some of you, this transformative process is often perceived as being positive and linked with personal growth and development. Change is generally viewed in a positive light as being helpful and beneficial in some way. This growth or development happens to us internally. This internal change, and by that I mean psychologically, this psychological change we sometimes know as a transition. Transitions involve psychological changes. This is perhaps not the best example to illustrate this because it gives the impression of a child perhaps growing up and going through physical changes. But it illustrates the idea that the small character on the left-hand side goes through some psychological change that causes them to grow internally and develop progressively into a different individual. Although the literature and many writers and theories write of change as being a positive experience, generally our attitudes towards change are far from favourable. It's clear that we need to understand our perceptions around change events that happen around us. Depending on various factors, some of us will view change like a glass half empty and see it as a negative thing and possibly feel threatened by the change, while other people will experience similar circumstances in a more optimistic light and view change more akin to a glass being half full. Although there are many books and theories written about change, most people are resistant towards it. And in this metaphor, it can be likened to two bulls locking horns. We push against change. We are resistant towards it. We don't want to go along with the change process. And you might reflect on times when you've heard people criticising developments that are perhaps coming in, policy developments or requirements to submit pieces of work or something like that, where people complain bitterly about the need to change or do something different. And this is an example of resistance. However, resistance is a necessary and inevitable stage within the whole change process. It is necessary for us to engage with our resistant thoughts and behaviours in order to work through them and somehow become transformed. Another feature of change is that change happens like it or not. What we can influence is how we respond to the change, and this involves that we take control. There are many slogans written on this idea that unless we take control within a change situation, the change situation will define an impact on us rather than us influencing the change. In order to take control of our responses, we have to first be aware and understand ourselves, which is achieved through reflection. And the reflective process is engaging in critical analysis of the self, and that can include the personal self and who we are as people, but also our professional self, our professional values and behaviours. This reflective process involves active learning. It's not a passive process. Reflection is not passive. It involves immersing oneself in the whole process of thinking about one's thoughts, feelings and responses to various experiences that we've had. Another component of this active learning is that it's preferable to engage in deep learning as opposed to surface learning. In the session we'll explain the differences between deep and surface learning and see how deep learning is much more complementary to the reflective process as opposed to surface learning, which can be seen as a bit superficial. You might have heard the expression teaching to test, which is an example within the curriculum of surface learning. And it wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't manage to use a penguin metaphor somewhere along the line, and this just illustrates the active process of a penguin pursuing the fish in this case, but in this metaphor I'm advising that you actively pursue deep learning as opposed to staying at the surface. In fact, I would advocate that reflection and the reflective process cannot take place without deeply and critically questioning one's values, beliefs and behaviours as they relate to our experiences. Okay, thank you. That wraps up our presentation on the introduction to change and change processes. Please consult the other learning materials which are also available via Moodle.